family called him a deadbeat dad at Thanksgiving. He invited the kids to his new family. Hi Reddit, my name is Jessica, and for the past few months I've been telling myself and even others a story. A story where I was the victim, where my ex-husband Moses was the villain, and where everything that happened between us was his fault. It was easier that way, easier to believe that he had walked out on us because he never cared in the first place. I asked myself, how could he possibly leave me if he truly cared? But now I'm sitting here, rethinking everything I thought I knew, realizing that maybe, just maybe, I was the problem all along. Maybe it was all my fault, and I was too ignorant to see it, or maybe I just chose to be ignorant. This all started at Thanksgiving dinner. My family and I were sitting around the table drinking wine, passing plates, and exchanging stories when the conversation took a turn I should have expected but somehow didn't. Moses' name came up, and as always, my family didn't hold back. They called him a deadbeat, said he abandoned his kids, and said I was better off without him. There were laughs, scoffs, and muttered comments about how pathetic he was for walking away. I sat there letting them talk, nodding along, pretending it didn't sting. I had told myself this version of events so many times that I almost believed it. Moses left. He moved away. He didn't fight for his kids. He chose to disappear rather than be a father. That's what I told people. That's what I told myself. And for a long time, it felt true. For a long time, I convinced myself it was the truth. But then, something happened that I never saw coming. A few days after Thanksgiving, my oldest came to me, casual as ever, and mentioned that Moses had invited them to spend Christmas with him, and not just with him, with his new family. I laughed at first, not sure if I had misheard. New family? I asked, thinking maybe they meant some distant relatives or friends he was spending time with. But no, my ex-husband, the so-called deadbeat father, the man who my family swore had abandoned his kids, had apparently moved on. He had a wife, a home, a new life, and suddenly everything I had believed, everything I had told myself about him, didn't make sense anymore. For the first time in months, I had to sit with an uncomfortable thought. What if Moses didn't abandon us? What if he was the one who had been abandoned? What if I had been lying to myself all along? I didn't know what to say to my kids. I nodded, pretending it wasn't a big deal, but inside I felt something unfamiliar twisting in my stomach. Was it jealousy, anger, or was it regret? Or rather, was it anxiety? Maybe it was fear. Fear that the truth would eventually come out. I had spent so long convincing myself that Moses was the problem that I never stopped to ask myself if maybe I had pushed him away. Maybe he wasn't the absent father I made him out to be. Maybe he wasn't the one who walked away first. Maybe I was. And now, as Christmas approaches, I find myself staring down a truth I spent years avoiding. My children, our children, are packing their bags, getting ready to spend the holidays with a family that doesn't include me, a family that Moses built without me. And suddenly I'm realizing that this story I've been telling, the one where I was the victim, doesn't quite add up. Because villains don't usually get happy endings. And yet somehow, Moses did. And I'm left here wondering if I was the one who deserved to be left behind. Moses and I were together for over 10 years. A whole decade of marriage, kids, a house, and responsibilities. On paper, it sounded like a solid life. And in the beginning, it was solid, maybe even happy. Moses was a good man, the kind who always put his family first. He was patient, dependable, and steady in a way that should have made me feel secure. He never raised his voice, never made rash decisions, never acted on impulse. I used to love that about him. But somewhere along the way, that stability started to feel suffocating. At first, I ignored the feeling. I told myself that every marriage slows down over time, that passion isn't something that lasts forever. But the more I tried to silence the nagging voice in my head, the louder it got. I started noticing things I hadn't before, how predictable our conversations were, how our date nights felt more like obligations than excitement, how the same man who used to look at me like I was his entire world now barely looked up from his laptop when I walked into the room. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was the one who had changed. I started resenting Moses, though I couldn't even pinpoint why. He hadn't done anything wrong. But that was the problem. He also hadn't done anything particularly right. He just existed. Worked, came home, helped with the kids, went to sleep, and repeated the process. There were no surprises, no grand gestures, no moments that made my heart race the way it used to when we were younger. And in my frustration, I started looking for reasons to blame him. I began to suspect that maybe he was having an affair. There was no solid proof, no evidence to support my suspicion, but my gut told me something wasn't right. He was distant. He stayed late at work more often than before. He didn't seem as interested in me anymore. That had to mean something, didn't it? I became obsessed with the idea that he was hiding something. I checked his phone when he left it unattended, went through our bank statements looking for unexplained charges, even glanced at his emails when he wasn't looking. But there was nothing. Nothing suspicious, nothing out of place. And somehow that only made it worse. Because if he wasn't cheating, if there was no other woman, then what was the explanation? The conclusion I came to was one that shattered me. He was just bored of me. That realization was the final push I needed. If he didn't want me anymore, if I was nothing more than a wife and mother to him now, then why should I keep trying? Why should I be the one to sit here feeling neglected and unfulfilled while he carried on like everything was fine? I made up my mind. I was done being the loyal, devoted wife. If Moses was going to be distant, if he was going to check out emotionally, then I was going to check out physically. I was going to do whatever I wanted, with whomever I wanted, and I wasn't going to feel guilty about it. And this is where Daniel came into the picture. It started with small things, because of course it always starts out small. It's always harmless in the beginning. Daniel and I were co-workers and would usually spend a good amount of time working on projects. The truth is that as soon as I decided I was going to do anything I wanted to do, I started seeing Daniel in a sexual light. The way Daniel would lean in just slightly when we talked, making it feel like I was the only person in the room. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, just harmless flirting. Something to pass the time at work, to break the monotony of the life I had built with Moses. But harmless things don't make your stomach tighten when someone walks by. Harmless things don't make you check your phone at midnight, waiting for a message that shouldn't mean anything, but somehow does. Daniel was different from Moses in every way. Where Moses was quiet, Daniel was charming. Where Moses was predictable, Daniel was exciting. He had this effortless confidence, this energy that made me feel like I was someone again, not just a wife, not just a mother, but a woman. He noticed things Moses never did, the way I styled my hair, the perfume I wore, the way I bit my lip when I was lost in thought. I don't know when exactly the shift happened, when our conversations went from playful to dangerous, but it felt inevitable. It wasn't a question of if, he and I were just waiting for when it would happen. Maybe it was the late-night texts that started popping up more frequently, just little inside jokes and comments about how exhausting work had been. Maybe it was the way he would brush past me in the break room, his hand barely grazing mine, but leaving a trail of electricity in its wake. Or maybe it was the night we went out for drinks after work with a group of coworkers, and somehow we ended up alone. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. It was just drinks, just talking, just venting about our lives, about how hard it was to be stuck in situations that no longer made us happy. But when we stepped outside, when the cool air hit my skin and I turned to say goodbye, Daniel closed the space between us. It wasn't rushed or desperate, it was deliberate. Like he had been waiting for this moment, and I let it happen. That first kiss felt like stepping off a ledge, like free-falling into something I couldn't control. It was wrong, and I knew it, but I didn't stop. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into it, let his hand slide down my waist, let his breath mix with mine, let my body press into him in a way that made it clear that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a decision. From that moment on, everything escalated. We stopped pretending we were just coworkers. The stolen glances turned into stolen moments and into secret meetings. Finally, the day came when we had mind-blowing sex. We started sneaking around, finding excuses to stay late at work, to take breaks at the same time. Hotel rooms became our escape, places where I could forget who I was supposed to be and just exist in the heat of the moment. I told myself it was just an escape, that I wasn't really doing anything wrong. Moses had checked out of our marriage long before I did, hadn't he? He was probably sleeping with someone else anyway. He had to be. There was no way he had been so distant for so long without another woman being involved. I had no proof, but at that point I didn't need it. I was determined to go wild this time around. If Moses was going to neglect me, then I was going to make sure I got what I deserved. I convinced myself that I was owed this, that this was his fault for making me feel like I wasn't enough, for not seeing me anymore. That if he had just been different, if he had just tried harder, I wouldn't have ended up in Daniel's arms. But even in the middle of it, even in the heat of it, there was always a voice in the back of my head, a voice that reminded me that no matter how much I justified it, no matter how much I blamed Moses, I was the one making this choice. And someday, that choice was going to catch up with me. I just didn't know how soon that would be. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always the worst, mundane, slow, stretched too thin. Between the chaos of the beginning of the week and the desperate crawl toward the weekend, I had spent the afternoon at work distracted, replaying the last time I saw Daniel in my head, still feeling the ghost of his hands on my skin. It had become an addiction, the secret life, the rush of it, the thrill of sneaking around, of knowing something Moses didn't. I came home expecting nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe Moses would be in the living room, scrolling through his phone while the kids finished their homework. Maybe we'd go through the motions of dinner, small talk, and another quiet night, where we barely looked at each other. But the moment I stepped through the door, I knew something was wrong. The kids weren't in the living room as they would be finishing up their homework. The house was stiffening quiet, and it gave me this eerie feeling that I couldn't shake off. Moses was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop in front of him, a look on his face that I couldn't quite place. It had this mixture of anger and sadness, maybe more of anger, but I just couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong. I thought maybe it had to do with his work. So I walked over and casually asked him what the matter was. But instead of answering me, Moses had looked at me with so much anger, I shivered right on the spot. He didn't even ask me to sit before he turned the laptop toward me. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. Screenshots, dozens of them, my texts with Daniel, my emails, a hotel confirmation under my name, time-stamped on a night I had told Moses I was working late. Some of the messages were explicit. Some were just enough to imply everything he already knew, but every single one of them was undeniable. I felt my throat tighten. My body went cold, then hot, then numb. I opened my mouth to speak, but I didn't even know what I was going to say. Moses didn't demand an explanation. He just stared at me, waiting for whatever excuse I was about to give. But there was no excuse. There was only the truth, laid out in front of us like a crime scene, undeniable and ugly. His voice was quiet when he spoke, probably for the sake of the kids, but that didn't reduce the deadly venom of his words. He told me that he already sent a copy of the evidence he gathered to my office, and that he wanted a divorce. He spoke with so much hatred in his low tone it shook me. He hated me. It was so obvious through the look on his face that he was disgusted by me, by my affair. I tried begging or coming up with a valid reason why I did what I did, but it was clear his mind was made up. He hated me and wanted nothing to do with me because the moment I held his hand, he shook me off like some irritating animal jumped his skin. He then walked out of that kitchen, went upstairs and started packing his bags. He didn't leave that night, though. He slept in our bedroom and locked me out, probably as one of my punishments. I stayed by the door and hoped he'd open up at some point during the night so I could plead my case, but he didn't. By morning, I left the door and went into the kitchen, trying to cook breakfast for the kids, so they didn't notice what was wrong. By the time I was done attending to the kids, Moses was gone. Days crawled slowly after he left. It was only when I had to go to the office 2 days after that I realized just what the extent of Moses's anger had led to. He had truly exposed me at the office. Everyone looked at me like I was a snake. The eyes and whispers when I walked through made my legs shake. And by the end of the day, I received a letter from the HR manager. I was fired, but Daniel wasn't. He still got to keep his job. Apparently, he had managed to retell the truth. I was the one who seduced him and even went as far as blackmailing him into sleeping with me. I was the only one left to suffer the consequences of our actions. Days passed after the embarrassment at the office, and somehow I managed to convince myself that I wasn't at fault, that it was all Moses's fault. He made me cheat, and he was punishing me for it. It wasn't at all my fault. And I told myself that he was just giving up, that he was walking away because he didn't care. That was the only explanation that made sense, or the only one I allowed myself to believe. In fact, I managed to convince my family and spin the truth. I told them that he got me fired from my job. I didn't tell them the reason why. I told them he was a coward who gave up on our family instead of fighting for us. I didn't tell them about the affair. Nobody knew except the people from work. And since I moved my kids and myself back to my hometown, there was no need for anybody to find out what I wasn't telling them. I thought I could get away with everything. But the one thing I couldn't stop, however, was my kids getting in contact with their dad. And now, months later, sitting here knowing what I know now, I realize the extent of the damage that I have caused. After the divorce, I told myself that I was the right one and that he was wrong, especially after the way he had disgraced me at my office and had me fired. I had taken control of my life instead of settling for a marriage that wasn't fulfilling. That's what I told myself. That's what I told everyone. But the truth was, I wasn't happy, not even close. The first few weeks after Moses left were the hardest. The house felt different without him in it, but I refused to acknowledge it. I convinced myself that Moses was the one who had failed, not me. That he had checked out of our marriage long before I did. That he had been distant, cold, detached. That if he had just tried harder, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere for affection. And when people asked what happened, I gave them the version of events that made me look good. I told them Moses had walked away, that he had chosen to leave instead of fighting for his family, that he had given up on our kids, on me, on everything we had built. My parents were furious. My siblings called him a coward. They all took my side without question. I let them believe it. I let them call him a deadbeat dad, because that was easier than admitting that I had been the one to destroy our marriage. Moses never spoke to me again, although he was always calling the kids and checking on them. I managed to convince myself that it was better that way. I had people on my side. I didn't need to worry much. And then the kids started to complain that their dad called less and less. It gave me more reasons to believe the lies I managed to convince myself with. I told myself I was right about him all along, that this was proof he didn't care, that he had only been there out of obligation. I told my parents, my siblings, anyone who would listen that Moses was an absent father, that he had abandoned our kids just like he had abandoned me. And they believed me. I remember the first time I found out he had moved. It wasn't from him. It was from a mutual friend of ours who had come around to town to check on his parents. Just like that. No warning, no conversation. He had packed up and left. I was livid. I convinced myself that this was his final act of selfishness, that he had started a new life, away from his children, because he never really wanted to be a father in the first place. But looking back now, I think maybe I had been the one that pushed him into it. He had been a good man, and I kept giving excuses for all my actions, right or wrong, and eventually I pushed him away. But at the time, I didn't see it that way. I only saw what I wanted to see. I only saw that Moses had disappeared, that he had replaced us, and that I had been right about him all along. Thanksgiving has always been loud in my family. It was the kind of holiday where voices overlapped, where my mother hovered anxiously over the turkey, where my siblings bickered over who got the last of the mashed potatoes, where wine flowed a little too freely. This year was no different, except for the fact that I felt completely disconnected from it. The conversation swirled around me. You know, the usual stories about work, about distant relatives, about politics, about nothing at all. But I wasn't really listening. I was just there, going through the motions, nodding at the right times, smiling when expected. It had been this way for a while now, though I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. Then, as it always seemed to, the conversation took a turn toward Moses. It started with a passing comment from my brother. He said something about how I was so much better off without him. My sister agreed. My mother sighed dramatically, saying she never understood what I saw in him in the first place. And then the floodgates opened. They called him a deadbeat, a coward, a failure of a father. What insult did they not throw at the man? They talked about how he had walked out, how he had abandoned his own kids, how he had taken the easy way out and left me to do everything on my own. I sat there and let them talk. I let them tell the story the way I had told it to them for months. The version where Moses was the villain, where I was the wounded mother doing everything on my own, where my children had been left fatherless because of his selfishness. I let them believe it. But even I knew something about it felt off. I didn't say anything, but my stomach twisted in a way it never had before. The words, the anger, the certainty in their voices, it should have been satisfying. It should have felt like justice, like validation. But it didn't. It felt wrong, like I was standing outside of my own life, watching myself let a lie spin further and further out of control. I finished dinner that night feeling unsettled and scared, even though I couldn't even stomach much. And then, a few days later, everything unraveled. It was a regular afternoon. The kids were at the table doing homework, the TV played in the background, and I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone when my oldest casually mentioned something that made my breath catch. Moses had invited them to spend Christmas with him, and not just with him, but with his new family. I stared at them, trying to process the words. My chest tightened. I asked them to repeat it, as if hearing it again would somehow make it make more sense. They spoke about it so casually, like it wasn't the bombshell that had just cracked my entire reality in half. They told me excitedly about Moses' wife, about his new home in a different city, about how happy he seemed. I felt like I couldn't breathe because I hadn't known. I hadn't even considered the possibility. In all the time I had spent painting Moses as a deadbeat, I had never stopped to wonder what he had actually been doing after he left. I had assumed he was just out there somewhere, floating, existing without purpose. I had convinced myself that I was the only one who had moved forward. But he had moved forward without me. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but I couldn't make my mouth form the words. Instead, I sat there, listening to my kids talk about Moses like he was a stranger, because in that moment, I realized who he was. He wasn't the man I had once known. This man had built a new life, a new family, and I wasn't a part of it. For the first time, I had to confront the truth I had been avoiding for years. And the truth was that Moses hadn't abandoned his kids. He had left my sorry ass. He had walked away from the life I had destroyed. And instead of fighting to stay in the wreckage, he had stepped back and let me tell the story the way I wanted to. He ignored me, and now I look especially stupid. I had thought I was punishing him all these years, but now, sitting at the kitchen table, I realized the truth. He was the one who had won, and I was the one left behind. Update. Hello, everyone. It's me again. It's been about a month since I found out about Moses' new family, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I wish I could say that I was over it, that I was happy for him, that I had moved on just as easily as he had. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I've spent the past few days sitting with a reality I've been running from for months, and it's unbearable. For so long, I convinced myself that Moses had abandoned us. I let that belief shape the way I saw our divorce, the way I spoke about him, the way I justified everything I did. I told myself that he left because he didn't love us enough to stay, because he didn't care enough to fight for our marriage or for his kids. But that wasn't the truth, was it? The truth is, I had destroyed our marriage. I had broken it beyond repair, and instead of facing that, I let myself become the victim. I let myself believe I was the one who had been wronged in a story where I had been the villain all along. Moses hadn't walked away because he didn't care. He had walked away because he had nothing left to fight for. I remember the night he found out about the affair. The way he looked at me, like he was seeing a stranger instead of the woman he had spent years loving. I should have known then that I had pushed him too far, that there was no coming back from what I had done. But I was too caught up in myself, too convinced that I could twist the situation to my favor. When Moses told me he wanted a divorce, I didn't even cry. I should have. I should have fought for him, should have realized what I was losing. But instead, I let him go, convinced that he would regret it more than I would. I was wrong. I used to wonder why Moses never came around or bothered to explain his side of the story to my family. Why was he content with only destroying my relationship at work and not with my family? But now I understand. Ever since my kids went to visit Moses and his new wife, they've refused to come back home. They've found out the truth, and now finally, what I've been dreading for so long has happened. My kids hate me. They no longer want to be part of the lies I made. They know the truth, and they want nothing to do with me. My mother had been upset about my kid's decision and had gone to Moses's place. She didn't tell me she was going, and I only found out too late that she went there to fight for her daughter. When she finally came back home, she was so angry and bitter. She pointed fingers at me and called me names: disappointing, disgusting, liar, and others too insulting to mention. She told everyone the truth, the real truth, not the one I had spun for them. She told them how Moses found out about my affair and had decided to expose me, which was why I moved home and lied to the family. My cousins, my siblings, and even family friends now look at me with anger and hatred. I cannot put into words the extent of discomfort I have now, living with my family who once adored me, now hating me for the lies I've told. I'm stuck mostly in my room just to avoid going out and hearing my mom make comments about how much of an embarrassment I am. I've lost all the battles I thought I was winning. Everything feels like it's crumbling all at once. Moses had apparently not only ruined my work life, but has now had his total revenge after months of keeping quiet by ruining my relationship with my family too, especially my kids. And I cannot even fully explain just how much regret I have now. I should never have cheated on Moses. I should have been content and not kept looking for ways to ruin the beautiful family we had. I should have been patient and not destroyed everything we had going on for us. I should have never thought to cheat because in the end, I'm the one who ends up losing the most. I had left him. Not physically, not in the obvious ways, but emotionally. I had checked out of our marriage long before he ever knew it was over. He wasn't the absent father I had spent years making him out to be. He was just done with me and my lies and wanted no part of it. And now, sitting here, knowing that he has rebuilt his life, that he has a wife who loves him, a home where he is happy, and children who still see him as their father. I don't know what to do with the weight of this regret, because God knows I can't fix it. There's no apology I can give that will undo the months I spent blaming him for something that was never his fault. There's no moment of clarity that will make this easier to accept. Moses has moved on, and I am still here, stuck in the past, stuck in the mess I created, stuck in a life where I can no longer pretend that I was anything but the reason everything fell apart. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for that. No, I know I will carry this burden of regret forever. Update. Hello, Reddit. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe I just need to get it all out, to admit to myself what I've spent years trying to ignore. Maybe I just need someone to tell me that I'm not crazy for feeling like my life has completely spiraled, like I'm standing in the ruins of everything I built and realizing a little too late that I'm the one who set fire to it. But this definitely is my last post here, though, because even though I keep typing, it still doesn't exactly do much. Not especially when you guys are so condescending. Well, I guess you could say I deserved it. It's my fault, and every day I keep regretting everything that I have done. Because things have gotten worse. So much worse. I don't know how, but every day fate seems to find something new and harsh to throw my way. Somehow my family just seems to hate me more for lying ridiculously to them, and my kids still want nothing to do with a lying mother. I had to rent a little room far away from home because my family's snickers each day were getting too much to bear. But it still doesn't kill this heavy feeling and burden of guilt that has now become part of my life. I'm utterly alone, frustrated, and depressed. David, that conniving snake, hasn't even called once ever since the incident at the office. He probably wasn't being truthful when he made all those promises to me whenever I was in his bed. I'll marry you if you ever think of divorcing your husband. It was all definitely a lie. He got exactly what he wanted, a fun distraction, a temporary escape. He got to play his games, and when he was done, he walked away without so much as a scratch. Meanwhile, I lost everything. But the worst part, the thing that has been gnawing at me, keeping me up at night, making me feel like I can't breathe, Moses is thriving, not just doing okay, not just getting by, but thriving. I found out through one of the few people who still talk to me occasionally, especially when she had something in mind to say about my current situation with Moses, though I know even she despises me. She mentioned it so casually, like it wasn't something big. She probably wanted me to know so I could realize just how badly I've behaved. She wanted me to realize the extent of my mistakes. Moses's career has taken off. He got promoted. He's doing better than he ever did when we were together. And his new wife, the woman I hadn't even known existed until recently, She's everything I never was. She's supportive, she's kind, she's loving, she makes him happy. And the kids, they must love her enough to stay with their father permanently. I don't know why that hurts the most, but it does. Because for months I told myself that Moses had failed as a father, that he had abandoned them, that they were better off without him. But now I can't ignore the truth. He didn't leave them. He left me, and he had every right to. I brought this upon myself. I destroyed our marriage. I lied. I cheated. I manipulated everyone around me into believing a version of events that made me look like the victim. And for what? For David? For a few moments of fun? For a fantasy I had built in my head about a life that was never going to exist? Moses didn't just move on. He upgraded. And I'm the only one who lost. I used to think that I could rewrite the narrative, that as long as I told myself the right version of the story, I could convince myself that I had made the right choices. But now, sitting here in this empty house, staring at the life I used to have from the outside, I see it for what it really is. Moses didn't lose me, I lost him. And the worst part is knowing that I can never get him back. This is probably the part where I tell you guys not to behave as badly as I have, so you wouldn't be stuck as I am. Well, I sure don't wish this life for anyone because it sure is very painful having to live this way. Goodbye, guys.